May 18, 2006. The owner of a recreational boat was heading towards Santa Catalina Island, a rocky island in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California. As he traveled, the man noticed seagulls circling over something in the water. There were many birds, screeching in a frenzy. Suddenly, he realized there was a body floating in the water. That was what had attracted the persistent birds. The boat owner immediately contacted the Coast Guard, who in turn called the sheriff's office. A heavily decomposed body was pulled from the water. It was in terrible condition. The only certainty was that it belonged to a human. The person was fully clothed and, based on the attire, appeared to be a man. However, his face was disfigured after prolonged exposure to the water. The body was found in an area frequented by international shipping lanes. These lanes are used by vessels delivering goods and passengers to the port of Los Angeles from all over the world. This led to the plausible assumption that the man had been aboard one of the cruise ships or cargo vessels. It seemed likely the poor soul had fallen overboard and drowned. The body was taken to the coroner's office, initially classified as a drowning victim. However, during the autopsy, the medical examiner discovered a bullet lodged in the deceased's head. The angle of entry made it clear that the victim was unlikely to have shot himself. The police launched a homicide investigation, with the first priority being to identify the John Doe. The deceased was fully dressed, even wearing gloves. When the medical examiner removed them, he found that the man was missing 3 fingers on his left hand. The fingers had not been eaten away by marine life. They had clearly been surgically amputated many years earlier. But no missing person reports in Los Angeles County, nor on the peaceful Santa Catalina Island, mentioned an individual with amputated fingers. The victim had been wearing fairly expensive shoes, indicating that he was unlikely to have been a crew member on a ship. More likely, he was vacationing or owned his own boat. Attached to the shoes were barnacles, calcium-based shells belonging to small marine crustaceans. A specialist identified them as gooseneck barnacles, a species found only in specific areas, including the backside of Catalina Island. This evidence suggested that after the man was killed, his body had entered the water near the backside of Catalina Island. By analyzing the varying sizes of the gooseneck barnacles, the specialist also estimated that the body had been in the water for approximately 15 days. However, it was unusual for a body to remain in the same area of the ocean for so long unless weighted down. Why hadn't it drifted further out to sea? This anomaly was explained by a weather phenomenon unique to the Southern California Bight: circular water currents. These currents trap objects, spinning them around the island. Thus, instead of being carried away into the open ocean, where the body might never have been found, it was caught in one of these currents. This whirlpool effect eventually brought the body to the front side of Catalina Island, where it was discovered. For a week, the police struggled to identify the victim. Then a man reached out to the detectives, worried about his missing friend. Having heard news reports about the discovery of a body, he feared it could be him. When the detective asked for distinguishing features, the man immediately mentioned that his friend had lost 3 fingers on one hand in a woodworking accident during school. This couldn't have been a coincidence. The body was identified by family members as 59-year-old Stephen Bailey Williams, a former radio DJ who had lived in San Pedro. The police began interviewing Stephen's friends and relatives to understand how he ended up near Santa Catalina Island. Stephen Bailey Williams, also known to fans as Stephen B., possessed extraordinary charisma and a magnetic voice, deep, resonant, and captivating. These qualities earned him a job on the radio, where he co-hosted a popular morning show in Denver. For many years, the show enjoyed tremendous success. Eventually, the station decided to move in a new direction, and there was no room for Stephen. As someone deeply passionate about his work, he struggled to accept being let go. Still, he didn't give up. He enrolled in culinary school and began crafting meals perfectly paired with specific wines, excelling in this new pursuit. Around 2001, Stephen's father's health deteriorated, and he moved in to care for him. For 2 years, Stephen devoted himself to his father's well-being. When his father passed away, he left Stephen a substantial inheritance, nearly $2 million. This windfall came just 3 years before Stephen's body was found. A new millionaire should have been enjoying life, but instead, Stephen lay lifeless on the coroner's table. Stephen found it challenging to manage the sudden wealth and the myriad bills that came with it. His friends described him as a creative and immensely talented individual, but one who was far from savvy with finances. Stephen could even forget, entirely in earnest, to pay his taxes. In September 2003, a close friend visited Stephen's home, bringing along an acquaintance named Harvey Morrow. Harvey was a former Wall Street financial advisor. His keen eye quickly noticed the unopened mail and the pile of bills on Stephen's table. During their conversation, Harvey realized that Stephen was overwhelmed and struggling to manage his affairs. Harvey offered to help untangle the mess. To Stephen, it seemed like Harvey was heaven sent, a guardian angel stepping in to save him. Grateful, Stephen entrusted Harvey with the management of his accounts and financial documents. Stephen's friends were happy for him until they realized that things were not as perfect as they seemed. Stephen regularly dined with his friend Sylvia Nolan. In 2005, they met once again in a restaurant, but Stephen didn't have the money to pay for his meal. He was very embarrassed. Sylvia paid the bill and wanted to lend him some money, but he refused. Sylvia, as a close friend, asked Stephen directly, "How can you have no money? You inherited $2 million and you can't afford to pay for your food?" Stephen replied that Harvey had put his money into an offshore account. It would remain there until he and Harvey withdrew it together. Sylvia remembered that someone had recently broken into Stephen's car and stolen various documents from the trunk. She asked if any of the stolen papers included a contract stating that Harvey would manage his finances. "What contract?" Stephen asked, surprised. His friend was shocked. Stephen had handed over nearly $2 million to someone he barely knew without even requesting any written agreement. Stephen's friends tried to reason with him and pointed out that something seemed suspicious about Harvey. But Stephen always brushed off their concerns. Things escalated to the point where Stephen was left with no means of livelihood at all. The last time a friend tried to talk to Stephen was in early May. They asked directly what Stephen planned to do about the situation. Stephen finally admitted that he needed to speak with Harvey, demand answers, find out where his money was and how he could access it. "I will get answers to these questions," Stephen assured his friend. After that, he disappeared and was never seen alive again. The police obviously needed to talk to Harvey Morrow, and they knew where to find him. Harvey had recently acquired a beautiful yacht, which he was meticulously refurbishing. It was a luxurious 22-meter vessel, suitable even for a round-the-world journey. Shortly after Stephen and Harvey met, the yacht began transforming as if by magic. Teakwood decking, large TVs, fireplaces, a gourmet kitchen, art pieces, a new navigation system, and stainless steel railings. The yacht was undergoing spectacular changes. Oddly enough, Stephen was enthusiastic about the yacht's renovation. He told his friends that Harvey planned to set sail around the world on the yacht with his wife Deborah. Harvey had invited Stephen to join the crew as a chef. Stephen eagerly agreed, and in November 2003, he moved aboard the yacht. He planned to take additional courses to qualify as a yacht chef. The voyage was expected to begin in 2 or 3 years, once the renovations were complete and the yacht was stocked with supplies and equipment. Incidentally, the yacht was the last place Stephen was ever seen alive. On May 25, 2006, 7 days into the investigation, detectives obtained a search warrant and headed to San Pedro, where the yacht was docked. However, the yacht was empty and immaculately clean, as though no one had ever lived there, despite detectives knowing that Stephen had resided on the vessel. Officers searched for evidence linking the deceased to the yacht, personal belongings, perhaps blood, but found nothing. They were also interested in the vessel's electronic equipment, especially the GPS device. Unfortunately, all they found was the user manual for the GPS navigator. The device itself was missing, which was particularly disappointing because GPS systems record and store all movements made by the vessel. Detectives were eager to find it, as it could immediately reveal whether the yacht had been near the island where Stephen's body was discovered. Finally, the officers found an expense ledger in which Harvey had recorded how much money he had spent refurbishing the yacht, over $2 million, roughly the same amount Stephen had inherited. It appeared that Harvey had used Stephen's money to make his luxurious yacht even more opulent, while Stephen was left penniless. The police left the yacht almost empty-handed, frustrated that they hadn't caught Harvey. However, employees of the yacht club informed them that they hadn't missed him. In fact, Harvey had been there, but as soon as he saw the police, he jumped into his car and sped away. An innocent man wouldn't run, confirming that detectives were on the right track. The hunt for the suspect began. The police contacted Harvey's mobile carrier and discovered that after leaving Los Angeles, Harvey had driven to Las Vegas where the trail went cold. He had destroyed his phone. Further analysis confirmed that both Harvey and Stephen had been on the yacht on the day of the murder, May 4th, 2006. That day at around 1 p.m., Stephen called Harvey's phone. Cell tower data showed Stephen's phone pinging from near the Los Angeles port, but later, around 4 p.m., both phones were together, pinging from a tower on Santa Catalina Island. Experts were able to pinpoint the yacht's location at that time. It was behind the island. Shortly after that, Stephen's phone abruptly stopped functioning. There was another curious detail. Before Stephen's death, Harvey had called him dozens of times a week. But after the murder, Harvey never called him again. The police now had enough evidence to arrest Harvey, but they had no idea where he was. All of Harvey's acquaintances claimed that he was likely on the British Virgin Islands, enjoying life on a large yacht among wealthy companions. Finding him would take a miracle. The police reached out to the media and contacted various government agencies, but they couldn't track down the fugitive. Months passed, and detectives believed Harvey had disappeared without a trace, leaving the guilty party unpunished. But on September 11, 2006, nearly 4 months later, officers from Montana reached out to them with new information. A former police officer, now working at a used car dealership, named Joe Parsitich, had called the Montana Sheriff's Office. Some time ago, a man who introduced himself as Harvey Morrow had walked into the dealership looking for a job. He was hired as a salesman. Initially, there were no complaints about him. However, Joe soon noticed that Harvey was making basic errors in calculations, odd for someone who claimed to have been a broker and financial consultant. Joe found this strange, but his suspicions grew when he noticed Harvey's car parked at a cheap motel. This contradicted Harvey's claims about where he lived. Joe couldn't understand why someone would lie about such trivial matters. What truly raised red flags were Harvey's stories about his past. Harvey claimed to own a beautiful home on the Gulf of Mexico, but said he had abandoned everything and moved to Montana after a tragic accident involving his wife. According to Harvey, his wife had been on a yacht with friends when a storm capsized the vessel, and no one survived. The alleged tragedy had left him unable to tolerate being near open water. Joe couldn't shake the feeling that something about the story didn't add up. That evening, he went home and turned to Google, hoping to learn more about the incident involving Harvey's wife. Instead, he found a Denver News article stating that Harvey Morrow was wanted in connection with a murder. The former policeman immediately contacted the sheriff's office. Everyone had assumed Harvey would flee to a tropical locale surrounded by wealthy people. Montana was far from fitting that description, but for a fugitive, it had one strategic advantage. It was close to the Canadian border. Harvey's choice made sense as a clever move. Detectives needed to act with extreme caution, as Harvey could easily cross into Canada if he sensed anything amiss. They relied on Joe to help ensure the arrest was carried out safely and without incident. Given that Stephen had been shot, it was possible Harvey was armed. On the day of the planned arrest, Joe, as the dealership manager, found ways to keep the other salespeople inside the building. When Harvey returned from lunch, Joe asked him to prepare a car for a potential buyer, whom he claimed Harvey had been showing vehicles to earlier. As soon as Harvey stepped outside, Joe called the officers, providing a description of Harvey's appearance and his location. Thanks to this detailed information, the arrest went off without a hitch. Harvey Morrow was quickly and efficiently taken into custody and brought to the local station. During the initial interrogation, Harvey behaved arrogantly, suggesting detectives should direct their questions to Stephen, as if unaware that Stephen's body had been discovered. Ultimately, he demanded a lawyer. Harvey was transferred to Los Angeles to stand trial. Despite the abundance of evidence against him, most of it was circumstantial. The prosecution lacked a crime scene, a murder weapon, or direct witnesses. The case promised to be a challenging one, requiring the prosecution to convince all 12 jurors of Harvey's guilt. In February 2007, the Los Angeles Yacht Club contacted the police. A GPS navigator was found in the yacht club's library, the same model as the manual found on Harvey's yacht. This was the crucial piece of evidence the police had been missing. The navigator revealed that on May 4, 2006, the day of Stephen's murder, Harvey's yacht had left San Pedro, traveled to Santa Catalina Island, reached the backside of the island, circled there for a while, and then quickly returned. The timestamps and movements matched evidence obtained from the cell phone records of Harvey and Stephen. Here's what the police believe happened that May night. Stephen Williams was a kind, open, and extremely trusting man, perhaps too trusting. He believed everything Harvey told him and was eagerly anticipating a wonderful journey. Stephen had been living on the yacht, unaware that it was being renovated with his inheritance. But by the time he realized the truth, it was too late. It's likely that Stephen decided to confront Harvey about his money. When they were behind Santa Catalina Island, Harvey approached Stephen from behind, shot him in the back of the head, and Stephen's body immediately fell overboard. Judging by the GPS navigator, Harvey circled the area briefly, possibly searching for the body, but then, confident in his crime, decided that the ocean currents would take care of the rest and carry the body further out to sea. He returned to San Pedro and the next day calmly went fishing with a friend. The trial began on May 12, 2011. During the opening statements, Harvey's lawyer made a shocking claim. He presented a promissory note allegedly showing that Stephen's father owed money to Harvey's father. In other words, Harvey hadn't stolen Stephen's money, but had simply been repaid a debt, eliminating any motive for murder. Investigators were confident the note was a forgery, but they needed time to examine the signature. The prosecutor requested the judge annul the trial. The second trial began in October 2011. By then, handwriting experts had compared the signature on the note with Stephen's father's genuine signature. They did not match. The note was a forgery. The prosecutor meticulously demonstrated, check by check, how Harvey had drained Stephen's account, spending nearly $2 million over 3 years to upgrade the yacht. The yacht was never intended for a global voyage as Harvey had promised, but was instead equipped to serve as a lavish showroom to bolster Harvey's image as a successful businessman. In reality, Harvey was no financial consultant but a con artist. True to his con artist nature, Harvey believed he could talk his way out of the situation and took the witness stand. He claimed that there had been a verbal agreement that Stephen would give him his entire inheritance. In a final insult to Stephen's family and friends, Harvey suggested that Stephen had shot himself. Among Harvey's many victims was his second wife, Deborah. A successful banking consultant, Deborah had no idea for 8 years that her husband was a fraud. She had always dreamed of a global voyage, and Harvey convinced her to sell their home in Texas to buy the yacht. For years, Deborah sent him $12,000 a month, cutting back on her own expenses, while Harvey indulged himself and maintained his false image. After Stephen's murder, Deborah learned the devastating truth. She believes Harvey planned to lure both her and Stephen onto the yacht to kill them both, but Stephen's confrontation accelerated the timeline. She also discovered that her dazzling engagement ring was a cheap fake, just like her husband. After a 6-week trial, the jury found Harvey Morrow guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Harvey Morrow will spend the rest of his life in a cramped prison cell, a fitting punishment for a man who valued freedom, luxury, and comfort above all else. Memphis, Tennessee is best known as the birthplace of the blues, but for a long time it held a dark secret, the highest crime rate in the entire country. Dr. O'Brien Cleary Smith knows the secrets of these streets better than anyone else. Dr. Smith dedicated his life to a job most people would consider far too grim. He was the chief medical examiner of Shelby County. Calling Dr. Smith an interesting man would be an understatement. Born in 1952, he served as a military surgeon in the Navy and took part in numerous combat operations, including Operation Desert Storm. Rumor had it that he was even a mercenary at one point. After his military service, he became a pathologist and later the chief medical examiner in Shelby County, Tennessee. His colleagues admired his tireless work ethic. He would race to crime scenes at any hour, day or night, and did everything his job required. It's no surprise he worked on some of the city's most high-profile criminal cases. His professionalism made him the most sought-after expert in court, where he testified with brilliance, explaining complex matters in a way jurors could easily understand. Although Dr. Smith was highly respected, his work was not without controversy. He never hid the fact that he always sided with law enforcement and often worked hard to build evidence against the accused, a stance that may have angered some dangerous or powerful people. One of the most controversial cases was that of Philip Workman. In 1981, Philip participated in the armed robbery of a fast food restaurant. Lieutenant Ronald Oliver, one of the first officers to arrive on the scene, was shot and killed. Police recovered a gun belonging to Philip, but the bullet that killed Oliver was never found or analyzed. Nevertheless, in 1982, a jury found Philip guilty, and he was sentenced to death. He remained on death row, never accepting his fate. Philip admitted to the robbery, but insisted he had not killed anyone, claiming that Lieutenant Oliver was accidentally shot by a fellow officer in a tragic mistake. Eventually, he was granted a clemency hearing by the Tennessee Board of Pardons, and that's when Dr. Smith unexpectedly appeared as a witness, bringing new evidence of Philip's guilt. Dr. Smith had used a new forensic technique involving an electron microscope to analyze skin samples around the victim's wound. He concluded that the bullet had been fired from Philip's weapon based on the type of firearms used by police at the time. But other pathologists criticized Smith's work, arguing that the tests he conducted did not meet professional standards and should not have been admissible in court. Rumors began to swirl that Dr. Smith had intentionally influenced the case to keep Philip on death row. After all, he never hid his loyalty to the police. According to Philip, Smith's testimony sealed his fate. and many supporters believed the forensic expert had sent an innocent man to die. Despite public outcry, clemency was denied. Phillips' attorney went to the media, publicly challenging Smith's findings. The case caught the attention of anti-death penalty activists, and then, in April 2001, strange things started to happen. Phillips' lawyer, the district attorney, and a local reporter all received anonymous letters laced with religious undertones saying Smith's evil deeds on earth must end, and God is calling us to act. Police opened an investigation into the letters, but at first didn't take them too seriously. However, in March 2002, the police began to take the situation more seriously. One night, a security guard discovered another anonymous letter outside the county morgue where Dr. Smith worked. But this time, the letter came with a Molotov cocktail and a crudely made bomb. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but the incident pushed the police to start patrolling the area regularly, hoping to catch the perpetrator in the act. Despite the threat, Dr. Smith continued to live and work as usual. This made those around him wonder, was he incredibly brave or just recklessly naive? But eventually, even a man with nerves of steel, like Dr. Smith, could no longer remain unfazed. In the pre-dawn hours of June 2, 2002, an officer patrolling the area around the morgue noticed something strange. Dr. Smith's car was still parked outside the building, even though it was well past midnight. The officer didn't dismiss it, especially given the previous incidents. He was familiar with Dr. Smith's late hours, but this was unusually late. Concerned, he decided to check if everything was okay. As he cautiously approached the building, he heard cries for help. Entering the morgue, he followed the voice and found Dr. Smith chained to a window grate. His arms were spread apart, a makeshift crown of barbed wire rested on his head, and his legs were shackled together. Dr. Smith resembled a man crucified. Except this time, there was a bomb strapped to his chest, rigged to go off with any sudden movement. Terrified, the officer immediately called for backup. Within minutes, police and a bomb squad arrived on the scene. The bomb squad risked their own lives to save the victim. One of them literally held the bomb in place with his hands to prevent it from moving, while the others carefully disarmed it. One mistake, one wrong move, and they all could have died. Thankfully, the team succeeded in neutralizing the explosive device. The bomb was then examined closely. It was covered with religious quotes and initials, including the letters JMJ, believed to stand for Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. After the explosive was dealt with, Dr. Smith was taken to the hospital. The barbed wire wrapped around his face was removed in the emergency room. He had sustained cuts and burns, but miraculously avoided serious injuries. Since Dr. Smith's life was no longer in danger and he didn't require serious medical attention, the police asked him to explain what had happened. This is his story. On the night of June 1, 2002, Dr. Smith was working late at the morgue, as usual. A little after 10 p.m., he locked up his office and exited through the back door onto a dark staircase that led outside. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows to his right. Dr. Smith had only a split second to register the man's appearance. He was about 6 feet tall and weighed roughly 200 pounds. But before he could react, the man threw a liquid directly into his face. It burned like fire, and Dr. Smith immediately recognized it: sodium hydroxide, a highly caustic chemical that causes severe burns on contact. Blinded and in intense pain, he instinctively raised his hands to his face, just in time to be hit with a second dose of the burning fluid, which made the pain even worse. While Dr. Smith was disoriented, the attacker struck him in the side, knocking him to the ground. But the assault didn't stop there. The stranger dragged him down the staircase. At the bottom, there was a barred security window. The man pushed Dr. Smith close to it. Lying face down, Dr. Smith could feel the attacker begin wrapping his body and head in barbed wire. The pain was overwhelming. Dr. Smith was completely incapacitated. The man had brought plenty of wire, enough to bind the victim's wrists and ankles, and to fashion a kind of spiked crown of thorns for his head. Then he ordered the doctor to stand. The attacker produced chains and padlocks, shackling Dr. Smith's arms high above his head to the window bars, pulling them as far apart as possible. His legs were bound tightly together at the bottom. As Dr. Smith suffered in agony, the man brought out a small device, about the size of a soda can, and glued it to the doctor's chest using superglue. Then, for the first time, the attacker spoke. Leaning in close, he said clearly, "Push it, pull it, turn it, and you die. Welcome to the ranks of the doomed." That was when Dr. Smith realized the device strapped to him was a motion-sensitive bomb. Just as suddenly as he had appeared, the attacker vanished, leaving the doctor beaten, bound, and chained to a window grate. terrified that even breathing too hard might trigger an explosion. Frightened and alone, the pathologist waited for death. As he later recounted, at that moment, all he could think about was not to move a single muscle in his body. He tried to remain completely still, breathing as carefully and shallowly as possible. But he couldn't stop thinking that the mysterious stranger might have also set a timer, and that the bomb would go off regardless of how still he stayed. All he could do was wait. After about an hour, he could no longer stay in the same position. He began making noise, hoping someone would come. Around midnight, nearly 2 hours after the strange attack, a patrolling officer discovered the doctor. Later, the medical examiner expressed deep regret that he hadn't warned the officer to stay back. He hadn't wanted to put the man's life in danger, but he had been so terrified, so exhausted, so desperate for someone to help, that instead he asked the officer to come closer. News of the attack on the respected pathologist, especially one so bold and bizarre, spread quickly. People believed things like this only happened in books. Local residents were deeply disturbed. A madman capable of gluing a bomb to someone's chest was on the loose, and no one could guarantee he wouldn't strike again. The perpetrator had to be found, and fast. Time was working against the police. A special task force was assembled, including officers from various departments. Police and the FBI joined forces and treated the case as a top priority. Investigators quickly connected the attack to the earlier Molotov cocktail and anonymous notes. By building a psychological profile of the criminal, they concluded he was extremely persistent, determined to achieve his goal, capable of constructing a complex plan, and obsessed with biblical symbolism and metaphors. Meanwhile, Dr. Smith began to fear for his own safety. He got a guard dog and started carrying a weapon at all times. He refused all interview requests and essentially withdrew from the outside world. Detectives concluded that the would-be bomber was upset about the role Dr. Smith had played in the controversial case of Philip Workman. They decided to speak with Philip. It was possible he had acquaintances on the outside who might have launched an attack on his behalf. Naturally, Philip denied any involvement in the crime and even suggested that perhaps the attack wasn't meant as revenge, but rather to frame him. He speculated that someone might have staged the attack specifically to damage his public support. It seemed like Philip genuinely wanted to help investigators. He asked them to explain in detail what had happened to Dr. Smith. After listening to the full story, he sat in silence for a while, visibly perplexed. Then firmly, he repeated that he had nothing to do with such a bizarre act of violence. And he added something that left investigators confused. Philip said the whole story sounded too far-fetched to be real and suggested that maybe the police should question Dr. Smith himself more closely. But the investigators dismissed the inmate's advice. Instead, they spoke with his family, friends, and anti-death penalty activists across the state. Despite their efforts and even surveillance of some of these individuals, police failed to identify any viable suspects. To their surprise, Philip was eventually ruled out as a suspect in planning the attack. However, Dr. Smith had been involved in many other criminal cases, so investigators had hundreds of potential leads to pursue. But as they checked them one by one, the special task force seemed only to be wasting time and resources. For 15 months, some of the best officers from various law enforcement agencies worked the case, yet none of them were able to move the investigation forward. And as more and more pieces refused to fit together, investigators began to ask themselves, could Philip have been right all along? Was Dr. Smith truly capable of staging the attack himself? When investigators began examining this theory, they immediately focused on one detail. For an outsider, pulling off such a complex crime would have been extremely difficult. The mysterious man needed to bring with him many different items: barbed wire, a bottle of chemical liquid, locks, chains, not to mention the bomb. He stood on the stairs with all these things and then carried out the attack under very poor lighting conditions. The perpetrator would have had to know the doctor's habits, specifically when he usually left home and which stairs he used to descend. Not to mention how difficult it would be to wrap barbed wire around a struggling victim without leaving deep scratches, injuries, or blood. Also, although the doctor's eyes were irritated by the sodium hydroxide, the damage was not irreversible. This was first noticed by the medics who assisted the pathologist on the day of the attack. But the events unfolded so quickly that they had no time to seriously consider this at the moment. The more the detectives analyzed the case, the more inconsistencies they found. For instance, during his first conversation with the police, Dr. Smith said that the stranger first tied his ankles with wire, then his wrists. But later, during a more intense interrogation in 2003, His story changed, and he said the man tied his hands first. One might have blamed this on the victim's nerves and shock, but Dr. Smith was a combat veteran. He was trained to handle stress. He was also in excellent physical shape for a 49-year-old man, yet one person easily overpowered him. The investigators did not hesitate to ask why he didn't fight back. Dr. Smith explained, "If you try to act macho, you could easily lose your life. You have a choice. You can resist, enrage him, and suffer the consequences, or surrender to his control." The wire didn't cause serious injuries because it was old and rusty. It could scratch unpleasantly, but not tear the skin. Dr. Smith voluntarily spoke with investigators for hours without a lawyer because he believed in his innocence. However, none of his explanations mattered. The investigators had already lost faith in his words. They directly told him that, in their opinion, he was lying and had staged the attack himself. After a year and a half, the investigation ended with an outcome no one could have predicted. On February 11, 2004, Dr. Smith was charged with possession of an unregistered explosive device and giving false testimony to federal investigators. The story hit the front pages again, but now he was no longer the victim. He was accused of orchestrating the attack on himself. The mayor reluctantly asked Dr. Smith to resign from his position as chief medical examiner. Dr. Smith was offered a deal: no prison time if he simply admitted to staging the whole thing himself. But if found guilty, he faced up to 20 years behind bars. However, Dr. Smith insisted he was innocent and refused the deal. He proudly declared he would never admit guilt. Dr. Smith hired the best lawyer and prepared for the battle of his life in court. Thus was set the stage for one of the strangest court cases in U.S. history, the case of the man in the wire mask. The trial began in 2005. For nearly 3 weeks, the jury heard testimony from 60 witnesses. The prosecution admitted they had no physical evidence conclusively implicating the defendant. Only circumstantial evidence was presented, such as minor injuries inconsistent with a violent attack, inconsistencies in Dr. Smith's accounts, the unusually complex nature of the alleged attack, and the absence of other suspects after a thorough investigation. The prosecution even demonstrated on a volunteer that a person could, if determined, wrap themselves in wire. Although difficult, the volunteer managed to do it. However, the main question remained: what could have been the motive? At the trial, psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz testified. The defendant's lawyer did not allow him to examine Dr. Smith, so the expert gave his opinion in general terms. He spoke about the concept of so-called factitious disorder, a mental illness in which a person fabricates injuries or illness to elicit sympathy. The best-known form of this disorder is Munchausen syndrome, where a patient artificially induces symptoms to receive care. The prosecution argued that Dr. Smith staged the attack to portray himself as a victim hero. Some people have a psychological need for sympathy, attention, and care, and being a patient provides that, explained Dr. Dietz, who cited the case of Tawana Brawley as a vivid example. Tawana accused 6 men in New York of kidnapping, assault, and racism. After months of investigation, it turned out her accusations were fabricated, and she staged the attack on herself. The benefit of such fabrications is always psychological and usually helps resolve unique hidden personal issues, added Dr. Dietz. The prosecution also showed that Dr. Smith sometimes lied about himself. For example, he told colleagues he served in Africa, where his entire family was brutally killed, a story entirely untrue. Most of Dr. Smith's fabrications were related to his military service, but perhaps he just didn't want to talk about where and how he really served. Overall, the prosecution did a huge amount of work, but their weak point was obvious. There were no fingerprints on the bomb, no purchase records for barbed wire, no chemical purchase invoices, and of course, no witnesses to the crime. Dr. Smith's wife, Marge, many friends and colleagues, including those who knew him during his Navy service, they claimed he would never have fabricated the attack. Even morgue staff who criticized some of his organizational decisions tearfully said Dr. Smith was a true professional and that they missed working under his leadership. The prosecution could not explain why Dr. Smith, in his quest for sympathy and attention, would risk putting a real bomb on himself, a bomb triggered by movement. He could have died instantly and would hardly have enjoyed the effect he created. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Dr. Smith admitted to journalists that when he listened to the prosecution's closing argument, he himself was almost ready to believe in his own guilt. However, the prosecutor failed to convince the jurors. Only 3 jurors agreed with the prosecution's arguments. The rest were not so categorical and were even angry, feeling that the prosecution had wasted their time. The judge dismissed the jury. The prosecutor realized he was unable to convince 12 people of his case and therefore did not try to convict the pathologist again. But officially, law enforcement considers the case solved. In their opinion, the attack was staged by Dr. Smith. Thus, the trial was over, but Dr. Smith still had one more battle to fight to restore his impeccable reputation. And as it turned out, this was an almost impossible task. He was not allowed to return to work as the Shelby County pathologist, and the man had to take up private practice. He gave testimony in court cases on behalf of defendants. After the 2002 incident, he received no threats, but admitted that he feared for his life. Until the end of his days, Dr. Smith insisted on his innocence. He passed away in 2019. We will probably never know what really happened that night on the poorly lit morgue staircase. Either it was the doctor's own idea, which he brilliantly carried out without leaving a single piece of physical evidence, or a mysterious man carried out a daring attack and has since never committed similar crimes, remaining in the shadows to this day. In any case, this astonishing case continues to fascinate those who hear about it for the first time. No matter what, whether Dr. Smith staged everything himself or some fanatic attacked him, both versions are equally chilling. In most American cities, there is a neighborhood where the houses are bigger and more beautiful, the lawns are perfectly trimmed, the grass is greener, and people enjoy an ideal life surrounded by upper-class families who have inherited generational wealth. In Detroit, that neighborhood is Grosse Pointe Park, the most desirable suburb with the best schools, churches, and parks. A perfect, picturesque place, like something out of The Truman Show, where nothing ever seems to happen. This was the neighborhood that Jane and Bob Bashara made their home, where they raised their 2 children. Bob and Jane had been together for almost 30 years. In Grosse Pointe Park, the couple was not only well-known, but also well-loved. 54-year-old Robert, or Big Bob, as everyone called him, was the son of a judge. As a teenager, he bought his first property and never regretted it. Over the years, he built a successful business renting out both residential and commercial properties. 56-year-old Jane was a marketing director. She had taken a break from work for a while but returned when the economic crisis affected her husband's business. In addition to their careers, the couple was deeply involved in volunteer work. They had 2 children, a son, Robert Bashara Jr., and a daughter, Jessica. Their lives were much like those of their neighbors, but that all changed on January 24, 2012. That evening, Bob and Jane spoke on the phone while she was driving home from work and he was tidying up around one of his rental properties. Jane said she was on her way home and would be there in 20 minutes. Her voice sounded normal. But when Bob arrived home around 8 p.m., he was surprised to find that his wife wasn't there yet. At first, he assumed she had been delayed by something, but as the hours passed, that explanation no longer made sense, especially since she wasn't answering her phone. Bob called the police. He wasn't in a panic, but he was concerned and asked for help. He also contacted their children and friends. Unfortunately, none of them had any idea where Jane could be. At 9:30 a.m., officers knocked on the door. They informed Bob that his wife had been murdered. He recalls falling to his knees. It was the worst news he could have ever received. They didn't explain how she had been killed and asked him to wait for the medical examiner's report. After that, Bob had to break the devastating news to his children himself that their mother was gone. A few hours earlier, tow truck drivers had started their shift in Detroit's east side. One of them noticed a black Mercedes SUV parked in an alley. It was important to note that this was a rough neighborhood. Abandoned houses, filth, trash littering the streets, and of course, rampant crime, especially drug trafficking. A luxury car like that wouldn't have stood out in Grosse Pointe Park, but here, it was impossible to miss. The vehicle was covered in dust and dirt, but on the driver's side, some of it had been partially wiped away, as if someone had leaned against it. Inside, Jane's belongings were scattered. Her purse's contents, a bottle of her prescribed medication, and on the back seat lay Jane herself. Her lifeless body, with bruises on the left side of her face and neck, told detectives a grim story. She had been brutally beaten before she died. Detectives began their investigation by speaking with those closest to the victim, starting with Bob Bashara. Bob was eager to help the police and answered all their questions. He allowed officers to search the house to ensure everything was in order. He told them that on the evening of January 24th, he and his wife had planned to work on their taxes. They spoke on the phone and he told Jane he would be home around 8 p.m. Bob said he had spent most of the afternoon and early evening cleaning up around one of the properties he owned. However, before heading home, he ran into a friend and had a drink with him at the Hard Luck Lounge Bar. The friends parted ways around 8 p.m. After some hesitation, Bob decided to share something else. He admitted that his wife occasionally used illegal substances, specifically marijuana. Jane would smoke it before bed to help her sleep better, and Bob didn't see a problem with it. He wasn't sure where she bought it, but he speculated that it might have been in the eastern part of Detroit. Bob could have been right, but before detectives could consider that angle, they needed to determine where Jane had actually been abducted and murdered. Examining the evidence, detectives found that the pieces didn't quite fit together. There were no signs of a struggle inside the SUV. While Jane's purse was on the floor, all her valuables remained untouched. A random thief would have taken them, which ruled out a robbery gone wrong. It also didn't seem like she had simply ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. The most logical conclusion was clear: Jane had been brought there. 2 days after the murder, the medical examiner confirmed what investigators already suspected. The victim had died a painful death. She had been strangled, most likely with bare hands. However, she did not go down without a fight. One of her nails had broken during the struggle with her attacker. This meant there was hope of finding the killer's DNA. Bob suggested that what happened to his wife might be connected to a series of unsolved murders. At the time, there had been a string of killings with a common pattern. Women who had arranged to meet someone they met on an adult website vanished, only for their bodies to later be discovered in the trunks of cars. Could Jane, found in the backseat of her SUV, have been the fifth victim? The police didn't think so. They had an entirely different theory. Investigators were working with the theory that Jane's body had been transported to the dirty alleyway, but that she had been killed 11 kilometers away, in the beautiful and affluent Grosse Pointe Park. That meant their top priority was verifying her husband's alibi. Detectives spoke with Mike, the owner of the Hard Luck Lounge Bar. The bar was located in a building owned by Bob. Mike's staff had seen Bob outside and inside the bar. Later, as Bob had stated, his friend joined him. His story checked out. Well, almost. Mike was surprised to hear that Bob had supposedly been cleaning up outside one of his rental properties. Bob never did that kind of work himself. He always hired someone for it. Still, multiple people had seen Bob, and his alibi seemed solid. But this is where one of the case's many unbelievable twists begins. Since there hadn't been a murder in Grosse Pointe Park for 20 years, the media paid a lot of attention to Jane's death. Bob was shown repeatedly in the news, which led to an unexpected result. People who knew Bob started reaching out to the police, not as the respectable resident of an upscale neighborhood or a landlord, but as Master Bob. Bob had a hidden side, a secret penchant for unconventional, intimate experiences. He had equipped a secret room for entertainment in the basement of the same building as the Hard Luck Lounge, where men and women would come dressed head to toe in leather, wearing masks and carrying whips. In addition to a bed, the room featured chains hanging from the ceiling, whips and devices for a more unconventional experience. In particular, a woman named Lynn contacted the police. She had met Bob on an adult website, and he had told her about his secret room beneath the bar. Lynn had never been to such places before, but she agreed to his invitation. They met at the bar with another woman, chatted for a while, and had some drinks. Then they went down to the basement and spent time there enjoying themselves. However, Lynn never returned after that night. The reason was that she had become more interested in the other woman, while Bob was excessively self-absorbed and too dominant over the women. Bob's new side of life was important to the police, as it provided insight into his character. However, investigators were more concerned with the fact that he had a long-term mistress, which had a destructive impact on his relationship with Jane. The woman who had been in the basement with Lynn and Bob, seemingly preferring submission in intimate games, was actually not as submissive as she appeared, because it was she who began to dominate Bob's life. Her name was Rachel Gillette, a 50-year-old divorced single mother. She worked as a secretary at Wayne State University. The lovers met on an adult website, but their connection was not limited to unusual pleasures. They had been seeing each other for over 3 years. Bob even attended Rachel's daughter's wedding in South Carolina in 2011. It seemed as if they were obsessed with each other. Rachel dreamed of making Bob a permanent part of her life, but when she saw him on TV mourning his murdered wife, she felt betrayed. She was shocked to realize that the divorce, which she had believed took place in May, was a lie. Now she found herself at the center of a scandalous case in a public investigation. This was the situation just a few days after the murder when, unexpectedly, Bob suggested to the police that they look into another potential suspect, Joe Gents. Bob Bashara and Joe Gents had met in September 2011. The men were introduced by Steve Thibodeau, the owner of a furniture and home equipment store. Bob had been buying supplies for his properties from Steve for years. Joe had once worked for Steve, and Steve had asked Bob a favor, to help Joe find housing. Bob agreed and even helped Joe make some extra money. Joe did some work at Bob's home and at his rental properties. Joe was a large 48-year-old man with the mental capacity of a child. During an interview at the station, he denied involvement in the crime. But while he didn't say much to the detectives, his behavior screamed that he was hiding something. Detectives wanted to clarify with Bob why he suspected his employee in the first place. However, before they could do that, Joe Jentz returned to the precinct to confess to the crime. His interrogation, which lasted for 2 days with breaks, revealed that despite Joe coming forward on his own, he kept changing and contradicting his statements. He would burst into angry outbursts, denying everything, and then, in a barely audible whisper, admit to the crime. At first, Joe claimed that he had done everything himself. Then he said that he acted under Bob's pressure. Here's what he essentially said. On that fateful evening, Joe arrived at the Bizaarre house around 7 p.m. under the pretense of moving some boxes. Bob let him into the garage. When Jane arrived, she started arguing with her husband. Bob then turned to Joe and said, "Deal with this." Joe hesitated, so Bob pulled out a gun and pointed it at him, making sure Jane couldn't see it. After a moment of hesitation, Joe struck Jane from behind on the neck to knock her to the floor. He then strangled her with his hands while Bob continued to yell at him. To finish the job, Joe pressed his booted foot onto Jane's neck. He was certain she was dead because he heard a cracking sound. Once it was over, Bob walked over to his dead wife and said, "Sorry, baby, I didn't mean to." The men then placed Jane's body into her SUV and Joe drove it to the eastern part of Detroit, where he dumped her in the alley where she was later found. What did Joe receive for this? It seemed like a simple question, but even with this, Joe kept changing his story. First, he said it was $2,000, then $3,000, then $4,000. Eventually, he settled on saying Bob had given him $8,000 in a used Cadillac. The detectives were unsure whether they could trust the chaotic account of someone with obvious intellectual disabilities. At the same time, they couldn't keep him in the precinct without charges. So they released Joe to go home and began verifying his story. First, they examined the phone records of both Bob and Joe. From September until January 27th, they had called each other 472 times. The day before Jane's murder, they spoke 22 times. Was there an innocent reason for these calls? Bob claimed that Joe had been asking him for money due to personal family problems, as he was going through a custody battle and needed money for a lawyer. On the other hand, Joe claimed that Bob had been calling him because, in the days leading up to his wife's death, he was in despair. He kept repeating that his time was running out and that his wife couldn't be in his way. He even mentioned that he had a deadline. Detectives guessed what that deadline might have been. Bob's mistress, Rachel Gillette, had grown tired of his lies over the 3 years they'd been seeing each other. Bob had claimed to be a widower, then a divorcee, and even promised he'd get divorced. Over the weekend before the murder, she had given him an ultimatum, demanding to see his divorce papers. Next, Joe stated that the struggle with Jane had occurred by the car on the driver's side, exactly where the dust had been smudged. He also described the items left inside the vehicle after the murder. The items he mentioned exactly matched what officers had found. After disposing of the body, Joe went to the nearest McDonald's to grab a bite to eat. The surveillance camera confirmed this as well. Finally, officers found Joe's shoes, which he had tried to dispose of by placing them in a donation bin. DNA from Jane was found on the soles, but the shoes weren't the only source of DNA evidence. Joe claimed that Jane had fought for her life and showed the detectives scratches on his chest and back to prove it. Therefore, it was only natural that on the broken nail of the victim, forensic experts found Joe Jentz's DNA. The detectives spent almost a month verifying his statements before they finally arrested him and charged him with murder. Bob Bizaarre's explanation seemed logical at first, as he insisted that he had no involvement in his wife's murder. He argued that his only mistake was trying to help Joe and giving him work. Joe, who had been dealing with a custody battle and needed money for a lawyer, was reportedly angry that Bob refused to simply give him the money. Bob suggested that this anger led Joe to kill Jane in an attempt to frame his employer. Bob's argument made sense on the surface. After all, if he had wanted to hire someone to commit such a crime, he wouldn't have chosen a person with an IQ of only 68, nor would he have done it in his own garage, in his own home. It seemed like a far-fetched scenario, but then Bob did something that no one expected. Steve Thibodeau, Bob's friend and the owner of a furniture store, came forward to the police after Joe Jentz's arrest. He revealed that a few weeks later, Bob asked him to come over to his house to look at a broken refrigerator. However, when Steve arrived, Bob began talking about how something needed to be done about Joe. Realizing the potential significance of this conversation, the police decided to equip Steve with a recording device and send him back to meet Bob, hoping that he would say something incriminating. The next time Bob drove to Steve's store, FBI agents were already following him. Bob seemed nervous, looking as though he hadn't slept in days. He immediately asked Steve if he was wearing a microphone. Bob even searched Steve but did not find the hidden device. Surprisingly, the first thing Bob said to Steve was that he hadn't killed his wife. He explained that he had no reason to do so, pointing out that Jane earned $125,000 a year and was much more valuable alive. Therefore, he suggested that Joe Gents must have acted alone or possibly with someone else's help. Then Bob finally got to the point. He promised Steve $20,000 if he could find a killer in prison who could take care of Joe. 3 days later, Bob returned to Steve's store with $2,000 in cash. He seemed to distrust Steve, speaking in hushed tones, but this didn't stop the police from recording everything, including Bob's request for a check, not for the killing, but supposedly for some goods. Moments later, after the meeting, Bob was arrested. He was charged with attempted murder. Faced with the evidence, including the recordings, Bob decided not to fight the charges. In court, he tearfully confessed to his plans to hire a hitman and apologized to Joe. However, he never fully explained why he wanted Joe dead. His apology seemed strange to many. It would have made sense if Bob wanted to get revenge for his wife's murder, but his actions contradicted that logic. If he had truly hated Joe, he would not have apologized. Instead, Bob was sentenced to nearly 7 years in prison for his involvement in the plot to kill Joe. Then, just 10 days later, Joe confessed to the murder. He was allowed to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for testifying against Bob. The trial against Bob began in October 2014. Looking at the defendant, it was hard to believe the charges brought against him. He was very polite, delicate, and appeared genuinely innocent. Since there was no physical evidence linking him to his wife's murder, the prosecutor decided to focus on the defendant's lifestyle. They called many people to testify about intimate encounters with Master Bob. Additionally, several pieces of circumstantial evidence were presented. For example, the ping from Bob's phone contradicted his alibi. According to the phone data, at the time of his wife's murder, he could have been at home. The officer who informed Bob of his wife's death testified that he did not react as dramatically as he claimed. However, the most incriminating evidence came from Bob's mother. Bob had always insisted that he didn't own a gun and couldn't have threatened Joe Gents with one. But his mother revealed that 5 months after Jane's death, she found a weapon in his safe deposit box. She reported the discovery to Bob's lawyer, who kept it quiet for 14 months before handing it over to the police. Although everyone thought Rachel was the other woman in Bob's life, the jurors heard that Bob had plans for another lover. He and Rachel wanted to live with another woman in a threesome. Several months before Jane's death, Bob and Rachel had been looking for a love nest. They particularly liked one house. If they wanted to move into that house, the final date for the deal was January 27th, just 3 days after Jane's murder. This was another deadline, after which Bob could say goodbye to the house they had their eye on. Moreover, he had already found a woman who could live with them in the house, Janet Lehman. Bob met her online and tried to convince her to move in with him and Rachel in Grosse Pointe Park. Janet replied that she didn't want to be the third person in a relationship, but Bob persisted. 2 weeks before his wife's death, he even traveled to Oregon to spend the weekend with Janet. Since the prosecutor focused on the defendant's intimate preferences and barely spoke about the facts of the case, Bob's attorney decided to prove that Jane had been aware of her husband's unusual inclinations and that this could not have been a motive for murder. The attorney called Jane's friend to the stand. The friend testified that once Bob invited Jane to a special party. It was supposed to involve all the guests throwing their car keys into a communal bowl, from which they would draw keys at random and then retire with the person whose key they pulled. Jane told her husband she would not attend such a party, but she allowed him to do as he wished. Bob's attorney argued in court that the defendant had not become this person overnight. He had been like this for years. Moreover, he had been married before and had divorced his first wife, meaning he knew how to part with someone without killing them. Additionally, the attorney pointed out several key mistakes made by the police. Since Grosse Pointe Park hadn't seen a murder in a long time, the detectives and forensic experts were inexperienced in investigating such crimes. They failed to check the victim's belongings for foreign fibers, did not gather surveillance footage from the bar to fully confirm or deny the defendant's alibi, and made errors during witness interviews. Finally, it was expected that Joe Gents would be the star witness for the prosecution. However, in court, he shocked everyone by refusing to testify. Bob's attorney was ready to tear him apart during cross-examination, but both she and the prosecutor had to accept that the man never took the witness stand. Now, Bob's fate rested in the hands of the jury. After nearly 3 days of deliberations, they reached a decision to convict the defendant on all counts, including first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, and then another incredible twist occurred in the case. In December 2015, a year after Bob had been sentenced, the judge received a letter from Joe Gents. This was not just any letter, but a written confession which had been dictated by his cellmate. In it, Joe explained that on that fateful January evening, he had gone to Bob's house alone, angry because Bob hadn't paid him for some work. He knew that Bob wasn't home. He entered the house, went into the garage where he was noticed by Jane, and he lost control. He killed her. Joe wrote that he could no longer live with the burden of knowing that Bob Bizaarre was completely innocent. By that time, Bob had filed an appeal, and this confession from Joe could change everything. The judge decided to hold a special hearing on this matter. However, when Joe entered the courtroom, before he could say anything, the judge explained to him that he had agreed to a deal with the prosecution, which required him to tell the truth, but he had lied, and now he was facing problems. Joe nodded, walked up to the witness stand, and holding his written confession in his hand, said that it was trash, that he had made it up, thinking he would serve a shorter sentence. He then began to testify, saying that Bob was with him in the garage during the murder of his wife. The judge denied Bob the request for a new trial. He lost his appeal and continued to serve his sentence in prison. Both Bob and Joe gave numerous interviews to the media after that. Joe continued to make highly contradictory statements. For example, during a phone conversation with a journalist, he claimed that 4 people had been in the garage during Jane's murder. But when the journalist asked him to explain what he meant and who else was in the garage, Joe pretended that it was very noisy in prison and that he couldn't hear her well. As for Bob Bizaarre, he always insisted on his innocence and claimed he would maintain that until his last breath. In this, he did not lie. In August 2020, Bob was hospitalized. By that time, he had lost a lot of weight and was suffering from diabetes. He passed away in the hospital at the age of 62. At the end of 2016, the building that housed the Hard Luck Lounge Bar in Bob's secret room burned down, and Joe Gents may be released as early as March 2nd, 2029.
Against the picturesque landscapes of Oregon, a gruesome tale of paranoia, chaos, and murder unfolds, starting out innocently enough. Valerie Faust, having worked as a guide at a remote cave resort for a long time, is ready to change careers. So, on her last night on the job, Valerie decides to go wild at a party. The wilderness, dark, gloomy caves, a wild party in a cabin from which it's impossible to leave. What could go wrong? 2 murders, one real, the other a product of filmmakers' imagination. Become so entangled that to solve the case, detectives had to review numerous videos featuring their prime suspect. Shane Moore was the middle child of a family of 5. His sister Kelly was 4 years younger than him. The brother and sister had been competing with each other from an early age. So when Shane decided to go to law school in California, Kelly enrolled there too. In the early 90s, Kelly was already working as a corporate lawyer, while Shane realized that it wasn't for him. He opened an antique bookstore in San Francisco. He read every book he sold, which helped him with sales. It was a successful business. Of course, his sister couldn't let her brother surpass her in the literary field, so she and her husband, actor Dan Reed, wrote a book called Fatal Medicine about Janine Jones, a serial killer. The book was quite successful. Some publications recognized it as a bestseller, and in 1991, it was adapted for television. A month after the book's publication, their first child was born, a girl named Aisling Tucker Moore Reed, who everyone called Tucker. The couple soon had 2 more children, but the bond between the mother and her eldest daughter was special. Everyone noticed this. Tucker grew up in a very artistic environment. Kelly surrounded her with love and support, attended all her performances, did her makeup, hairstyles, and outfits. Kelly put her career on hold for the sake of her daughter's future career. By 2000, she and her husband had divorced, and since Kelly was not working, her parents supported her financially. In fact, they provided for her and her children. They gave her a set amount every month and bought a charming house near the ranch in Oregon where they themselves settled. It was a beautiful ranch, located on 150 acres of land. Also in 2000, Shane moved in with his parents to take care of their sick father. Kelly and Shane's father had once served as a Navy admiral, but now he was suffering from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. For 6.5 years, Shane took care of his father and did all the work on the ranch. Although he and Kelly still didn't always see eye to eye, Uncle Shane was his niece Tucker's biggest fan. He was very proud of her performances in local productions and often talked about it to his friends. As Tucker grew older, she joined a rock band, sang, acted, created costumes, and wrote articles for the newspaper. Together with her mother and younger sister, she wrote a book in her teenage years, which became the first in a series and was also popular. But one event severely darkened the previously happy life of the young woman. After graduating from high school in 2010, Tucker enrolled at the University of Southern California, a prestigious institution known for training journalists, actors, and theater performers. However, an unforeseen event disrupted her dreams. Tucker was dating a young man who, according to her, wanted to take their relationship to a more intimate level, but she wasn't ready for that. He insisted and essentially got his way. The girl accused him of assault and filed a police report. However, neither the university, the police, nor the prosecutor's office found evidence of his guilt, but Tucker decided to go further. At the university, she was a reporter and editor of the student newspaper, and also ran a blog called All in Bandages. The blog no longer exists, but in it, Tucker, who spoke out against violence, shared her experiences. She also founded a coalition against violence at the university. This brought a lot of attention to her story. The blog was quite helpful overall, with Tucker sharing useful articles and resources for other girls. However, she mentioned the name of her alleged assailant, and after she failed to get support from the university, the police, or the prosecutor's office, the young man filed a counterclaim. She had to delete all posts about him. They settled the matter in court, but the incident left a mark on her. Tucker dropped out of school and returned to Oregon, where she got a job as a reporter. At first, everything was going well, but gradually the rivalry between Kelly and Shane resumed. Kelly had her own vision of how the ranch should be managed to be profitable. The relationship became tense, arguments became frequent, and on July 26, 2016, an emergency call was received from an agitated woman reporting that Shane Moore was lying on the porch injured and in urgent need of medical help. The woman who called identified herself as Carla Treiber, a notary. She heard the shot, but didn't know who fired or how badly Shane was injured. She refused to go out on the porch to check if he was alive. However, she handed the phone to Carlton Olson, Shane's neighbor, who began to assist the man, following the operator's instructions. It was very important for someone to try to help the injured man. The ranch was located 35 kilometers from the nearest hospital, and it took the medics half an hour to reach the victim. Unfortunately, this was too long a period to help him. The man died from a single gunshot wound to the chest. When the police arrived, they detained everyone present at the ranch, at least to question them. However, the woman who had called emergency services, notary Carla Treiber, was not at the ranch. She was in such a panic that after handing the phone to Carlton Olson, she fled the scene. When the police managed to contact her, she stated that she did not witness the shooting personally, but knew who was not on the porch at the time of the shot. According to her, Shane, Tucker, and Kelly were on the porch. When the police questioned 59-year-old Kelly, she unleashed all her hatred on her dead brother. Kelly claimed that Shane was the black sheep of the family. She alleged that he not only used illegal substances, but also manufactured them on the ranch. The woman told the police that she and her daughter were forced to move to the ranch due to her brother's dangerous behavior because they feared for their aging mother. However, Shane supposedly perceived their presence as a threat. 9 months prior, the tension had reached a breaking point. In September 2015, Tucker, who was not shy about using strong language, insulted her uncle. Shane took a plastic oil can and, in a fit of rage, threw it at the door behind which the girl was standing. The door was closed, but was essentially just a protective screen, so the oil can flew through it and hit Tucker in the face. Of course, she filed a complaint against her uncle. He was charged with fourth-degree domestic violence and was prohibited from contacting his niece. Kelly told the detectives that this only infuriated Shane further, and his threats increased. She claimed that he threatened to kill them if Tucker didn't drop the charges. According to Kelly, the man went into a rage upon learning that she had invited an appraiser to assess the value of the ranch. She wanted to sell it, and Shane, who lived on the ranch, was not thrilled with the idea. However, regarding the specific moment of the shooting, Kelly refused to testify, stating that the trauma of the incident prevented her from remembering what happened and who shot Shane. 26-year-old Tucker, on the other hand, claimed that she shot her uncle in self-defense. Through tears, she assured the detectives that she did not intend to shoot and thought she had to cock the hammer before firing. The detectives immediately found this statement strange. What did she expect to achieve by pulling the trigger, sincerely believing that there would be no shot? A little later, the girl admitted that she had found the revolver, which most likely belonged to her grandfather. Tucker wanted to check if it was loaded, so she went out onto the porch and fired it. She then handed it to her mother, who placed it in a room under a napkin so the notary wouldn't be scared by the sight of the weapon. Thus, the women prepared everything in case they needed to protect the house. Tucker was arrested on charges of manslaughter. She posted bail the next morning and was released from jail. Tucker and her mother firmly stuck to the story they told the police. They claimed they were afraid of Shane, and Tucker shot him to protect herself and her mother. However, certain aspects puzzled the police. The fact is, on that fateful day, it wasn't the notary who first called emergency services, but Shane. He called 911 at 1:40 p.m. because he himself was frightened. Shane told the operator that Tucker had fired a gun that morning and he took it as a warning. He explained to the operator that he was expecting the notary's arrival, and given his relationship with his sister and niece and the fact that Tucker chose that day to practice shooting, he asked if he could count on the sheriff's presence because he was scared and didn't want any trouble. Unfortunately, the police don't get involved in such domestic disputes, and the sheriff didn't respond to his request by sending an officer to the ranch. Additionally, investigators were puzzled by the fact that when Shane was killed, he had no weapon, and he wasn't even standing near the door. He was almost 2 meters away from it. Furthermore, Tucker shot the man straight in the chest. Moreover, when specialists examined the murder weapon, they found other controversial points. Based on the state of the revolver, it had been fired only once. But Tucker herself confirmed that she fired it in the morning. This means that before Shane's murder, someone had removed the spent shell and reloaded the weapon so it was fully loaded. Suddenly, Tucker's statements didn't sound as truthful and innocent. This indicated premeditation in the crime. The police needed an outside perspective on the family dynamics, so they contacted Shane and Kelly's brother, Ryan. After talking to him, the main characters in this case revealed themselves from a new angle. Ryan considered Shane the kindest and most pleasant member of their family. Like Kelly, he had moved closer to their parents, but unlike her, he was not idle. All the work on the ranch relied on him. He tended to the garden, the forest, the house, and took care of their sick father and then their elderly mother after their father's death. After both parents passed away, the ranch was supposed to be split equally between Kelly and Shane. Other family members, including Ryan, did not lay claim to the ranch at all. However, Kelly was clearly not satisfied with this and came up with various ways to squeeze everything she could out of the ranch right away, thereby encroaching on her brother's share as well. After their father's death, Kelly forced their mother to take out loans and credits from the bank. Additionally, the ranch was adorned with a magnificent forest, which Kelly wanted to sell for timber. Naturally, Shane disliked all these actions because the loans and the plan to cut down the forest could greatly devalue the ranch, and accordingly, his share of the inheritance. The ranch was worth $6 million. In other words, Kelly was dipping into not only her inheritance, but also Shane's. It got to the point where Kelly tried to include a condition in their mother's will stating that if Shane harmed her or her family, he would immediately lose his right to inheritance. Aggressive behavior would include not only attacking the women, but even damaging their car. Learning about his sister's cunning plans, Shane wanted their mother to rewrite the ranch to both him and Kelly now, splitting it 50-50ths. Of course, he would continue to take care of their mother, but would be sure that Kelly would stop her encroachments. And their mother agreed. She was ready to sign such a document. That was precisely why Shane had invited the notary to the ranch that day. In other words, Shane died on the very day he was supposed to get what he wanted. Regarding Ryan's relationship with Kelly, he said they stopped talking after a family celebration. He directly accused his sister of taking advantage of their parents, after which she attacked him with a fireplace poker. According to him, Tucker's temperament was no different from her mother's. The police also interviewed Stacy McKenzie, another of Shane's neighbors. Once again, her words contradicted the testimonies of Kelly and Tucker. She said that Shane was the one who lived in fear, not his sister and niece. On the day he died, Shane was plagued by bad premonitions. That morning, he told Stacy that he was afraid he was going to die. So, when she heard a shot in the middle of the day, Stacy ran outside and found Shane lying on the porch. She couldn't believe her eyes. Her friend was lying in a pool of blood, gasping in pain. Tucker was standing over him with a revolver in her hand, shouting, "Just die already!" Tucker was angry that Shane was taking too long to die. Hearing her words, her mother shouted, "What? He's not dead yet? Why aren't you dead yet, Shane?" And all of this was accompanied by obscene language. Stacy also mentioned that Kelly was the greediest person she had ever known. Kelly didn't believe that her brother genuinely cared for their parents and thought it was just a ploy to get all the inheritance. But in reality, after their mother's death, Shane wanted to take his half of the ranch's value in cash and simply move away from his sister. To avoid any disputes over the will, he wanted to settle everything now. Despite all the facts uncovered by the investigators, the police lacked evidence that conclusively proved Tucker's actions were intentional. Therefore, the prosecution could only charge her with involuntary manslaughter, and most likely she would be acquitted, with her actions deemed self-defense. However, 6 months later, detectives received unexpected help from Tucker herself. Her lawyer approached the prosecution and handed over a video. He accompanied it with an explanation that the video unequivocally proved it was self-defense. He assured them Tucker would be immediately acquitted. But when the prosecutors reviewed the video, they came to the opposite conclusion. Tucker was filming the video. She was providing commentary on what was happening. The girl filmed the room where the notary, Kelly's mother, and Tucker herself were present. She captured how her uncle approached the house and peered inside from a distance through the window. Throughout this time, she insisted he was dangerous. However, it was difficult to believe this because the man walked very slowly past the house, unarmed, in flip-flops and a t-shirt. He did nothing and did not come close to the windows. During this time, her mother started shouting that she thought the notary had been invited to add an additional clause to the will. Therefore, she tore up the prepared document. Apparently, the man saw Kelly tear up the paper prepared by the notary or heard his sister's loud cries and approached the front door. He opened it slightly and asked what was going on. But he did not enter the house, and as soon as he heard that his niece, whom he was forbidden to approach, was inside, he stepped back onto the porch. Kelly and Tucker raised a terrible racket. Tucker yelled for her mother to get the gun. Kelly ran to the door, and Tucker dashed for the pistol, which was under a napkin, and also ran to the front door. She yelled, "Get out of here!" and fired. Apparently, her mother was only pretending to fight with her brother at the front door as he was found too far away from her. According to the police, Kelly opened the door, but Shane was not behind her. However, this did not stop her. She shot her unarmed uncle directly in the chest. After that, there were terrible screams from the mortally wounded man. From the room where the notary and Kelly's mother remained, the front door was not visible. However, the notary confirmed that Shane did not enter the house. After viewing the video, the prosecution charged 28-year-old Tucker with first-degree murder. When she was denied bail, Tucker reacted in a highly theatrical manner. She pretended to faint and screamed behind the courtroom doors. Her wails could be heard far beyond the room. It's hard to believe, but the story gets even more intriguing. After the bail hearing, a local filmmaker approached the police. He explained that after Tucker was released on bail 2 years ago, she had starred in his film titled From the Dark. The film crew had no idea that she was charged with involuntary manslaughter because they didn't check the actors' backgrounds. Moreover, she went by the stage name Vin Reed. Vin Reed, or Tucker Moore Reed, played the lead role of Valerie Faust in the film. Valerie had worked as a tour guide in Oregon caves for many years, but decided to let loose at her farewell party. Unexpectedly, Valerie finds herself armed in the darkness, illuminated only by the light from her phone's flashlight. Suddenly, another person emerges from the darkness, trying to calm her down and persuade her to hand over the weapon, but consumed by fear and panic, she shoots him. She believes it's self-defense, but in reality, Valerie has killed him. The similarities between the film's plot and her real-life crime are simply chilling. Investigators couldn't believe it. First, Tucker personally filmed herself killing her uncle. Then, after being released on bail for this crime, she read the script, auditioned, and starred in the lead role in a film that almost completely mirrors the murder she committed. But watching her performance in court as a defendant charged with first-degree murder was not possible. The prosecution feared they might not win the case. Surely, among the 12 jurors, there would be at least one who would believe Tucker's claim that she was afraid of her uncle. Therefore, Tucker was allowed to plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter, and the charge of first-degree murder was dropped. In 2020, the 30-year-old woman was sentenced to 6 years in prison. She filed an appeal, but it was rejected. Interestingly, before she agreed to the plea deal with the prosecutor, additional charges were brought against her. While awaiting trial in prison, during a search on January 1st, 2020, prohibited substances were found in her belongings in her cell, some of the strongest and most dangerous among them. Tucker was charged with possession of prohibited substances and contraband. This woman literally gives the prosecution evidence against herself. First, she provided them with a video proving her guilt in her uncle's murder, and then she continued to break the law in prison before the trial began. Nevertheless, considering the time Tucker spent in prison before her trial, she could be released as early as November 25th, 2024, when she will be 35 years old. Her mother, Kelly, was not charged because investigators could not find evidence of conspiracy, although they couldn't shake the thought that she played not a minor role in this. She still lives in Oregon in a house bought for her by her parents, close to her beloved mother.
August 1988. 9-year-old Delphine Boulet set off with her brother Nicolas to a scout camp near Deauville, France. Nicolas had been spending his summers in the secluded camp, nestled in a picturesque location, for 2 years in a row and had always had a wonderful time. This year, his younger sister joined him, but the last week of summer vacation, which should have been filled with joy and laughter, turned into a nightmare. One night, while she was supposed to be sleeping peacefully in her tent, Delphine vanished without a trace. The camp was not as safe as the children's parents had believed, and if not for chance, the pleasant guy with a dark gaze, as the abductor was described by his friends, might never have been caught, and the case might have remained unsolved. The Boulet family had always lived in the Paris region, in Issy-les-Moulineaux. Alain and Marie-Josée Boulet were raising 2 wonderful children, their son Nicolas and his younger sister, Delphine. For 2 summers in a row, Nicolas had spent his holidays at a scout camp. In 1988, his 9-year-old sister Delphine joined him. The trip took place in August, during the last week of vacation before the new school year began. Wanting to make their daughter happy, her parents let her spend a week in the great outdoors at the camp. Like many parents, Alain and Marie-Josée felt a twinge of anxiety at sending their children away for so long, but they were confident the camp would provide proper supervision. They would soon learn, however, that this was not the case. Early on the morning of Saturday, August 27, 1988, the phone rang in the Boulet family's home. Alain picked up the receiver. It was the director of the camp where his children were staying. "She is no longer at the camp," the man said. He repeated the phrase 2 or 3 times, but Alain couldn't comprehend it. The words simply wouldn't fit in his mind, a thought he refused to believe. What did it mean that his daughter was no longer at the camp? Where was she? When the director finally managed to convey that they could not find the girl, Alain knew he had to leave immediately and go there. The scout camp was located in Villeville, a small village just a few kilometers from Deauville, right on the seashore. The village is famous as the filming location of A Monkey in Winter, based on the novel by Antoine Blondin, starring Jean Gabin and Jean-Paul Belmondo. Those familiar with this classic of French cinema will remember the scene where the 2 main characters stand behind the counter of the Le Cabaret Normand restaurant, filmed right there in Villeville. The camp itself was set in nature, on an elevated spot, offering a magnificent view of the coast. It consisted of 3 tents, housing around 20 or 25 children. Among them were only 2 girls, Delphine and her 10-year-old tent mate, Marlene. On the morning of Saturday, August 27, Marlene woke to find, to her surprise, that Delphine was not beside her. She quickly went to inform the camp leaders. Staff searched for Delphine, but as the tents were in the middle of nowhere, there were no nearby places where the girl could have wandered on her own. They quickly realized they would not be able to find her themselves. They informed her parents of her disappearance and called emergency services. A large-scale search operation was launched. More than 200 gendarmes were mobilized, joined by firefighters and volunteers. They combed through several square kilometers of terrain. Helicopters, divers, and canine units were brought in. Not a single ditch, grove, field, or meadow was left unsearched. At the time, everyone assumed that Delphine had left the camp on her own. Several details seemed to support this idea. First, she had gone in her shoes and taken a flashlight. Second, the day before her disappearance, there had been a small incident. Delphine had lost her scout troop flag. She might have dropped it near the old aquarium in the village of Trouville-sur-Mer, which the children had visited. Police speculated that the girl might have set out to look for it there. Of course, this theory was checked, but it led nowhere. But even if the girl had decided to leave on her own, That didn't change the fact that such a venture was extremely dangerous for a child. This part of Normandy is marshy, wooded, and largely sparsely populated. Not only was the terrain itself hazardous, but she might have encountered wild animals or died from hunger or thirst. On the other hand, the area had many farms and barns where she could have found shelter. And as a scout, she would in theory have been able to survive and even feed herself for several days. On one farm, a discarded apple core was found, and for some reason it was assumed to have been left by Delphine. After 3 days of searching, police were convinced that the girl had, for some reason, left the camp on her own and was now afraid to return, fearing punishment. Delphine's parents could not simply sit back. Each day they rose at dawn and went to bed late, taking part in the search for their daughter and posting leaflets appealing to anyone who might have seen her. Alain, the girl's father, told reporters that his daughter was quite strong and resilient for her age, loved walking, and could have covered several kilometers, but he did not truly believe she had run away. Like many children, she was shy, and running away did not fit her character at all. Delphine grew up in a very close and loving family. She was close to her brother Nicolas. She was intelligent, a good student, and had many hobbies, particularly dance. There were no problems at home or at school, and she had no reason to run away. Even so, Alain did not rule out any theory that might explain his daughter's disappearance. He took a loudspeaker and began driving through the region in his car. "Delphine, it's Papa. Show yourself. You won't be scolded. I'm begging you, darling. Come out to Papa," he repeated over and over. He drove like this for hours on end, pleading with his daughter to stop hiding. He held on to the hope that she had simply run away and was afraid to come back to her parents for fear of being punished. Because if it wasn't a runaway, then Delphine's fate could be far worse, and he didn't want to think about that. But the more time passed, the more both the parents and the police began to wonder if this truly wasn't a runaway. The prosecutor opened a criminal investigation. On September 6th, about 20 kilometers from Villerville, a man out gathering mushrooms came across a partially burned body. When the police arrived, they confirmed it was the body of a young girl. It was in a terrible state. It had clearly been doused with a flammable liquid to intensify the flames. Officers also found a rope that had been used to bind the victim. The girl had been struck several times at the back of the head against rocky ground, and there were signs of strangulation. However, she had not been strangled with hands or rope. It was more likely caused by some sort of gag forced into her mouth. Since parents often keep their children's first baby teeth, investigators compared one such tooth with remains from the burned body. Thanks to this tooth, the victim was identified as Delphine Boulet. Because she had first been struck on the head, there was hope that she had already been dead when set on fire and had not felt it. From experience, investigators in such cases immediately suspected they were dealing with a sexual assault followed by murder, with the fire set in an attempt to destroy evidence. It was clear the case had taken an entirely new turn, and after the discovery of the girl's body, the police began searching for her killer. Naturally, suspicion immediately fell on the camp staff. There were 5 of them in total, including the camp director. They conducted themselves with dignity, understanding that the police were simply doing their job. They insisted on their innocence and were soon released, as there was no evidence suggesting their involvement. Time passed, and the police still had no new suspects. They interviewed around 3,500 people, hoping that locals in the area might know something. They looked into possible involvement by individuals previously convicted in cases involving attacks on children. Unfortunately, it was a complete failure. The investigation had not moved forward an inch. Officers feared that if the attack had been committed by someone who didn't know the family and had never been in trouble with the law before, finding him would be possible only by sheer luck. Incredibly, it was luck that eventually helped solve the case. It was autumn 1990. Remy Boivin, a restaurateur from Deauville, accidentally discovered a briefcase in an apartment provided to one of his employees. The briefcase was filled with newspaper clippings about the tragedy at the camp, many clippings. But most importantly, there was more than just that inside. Inside the briefcase was a letter confessing to Delphine's murder. The letter was addressed to the girl's mother, although she had, of course, never received it. The author wrote that he was drawn to sexually assaulting and killing girls. He said he saw Delphine in town and liked her. He wrote, "She will be mine in 4 days. Later, you will find her body. It will be cold, and the body will be completely naked. She will be assaulted and strangled. That's all. I wanted to warn you." The letter was written by Remy's employee, a dishwasher at his restaurant, 29-year-old Gerard Labourg. Gerard was immediately taken into custody. He did not resist. The man gave a detailed confession about Delphine's murder and the abuse she suffered. Gerard explained that he had stumbled upon the children's camp completely by chance during a walk. Instantly, a plan formed in his mind. He bought gasoline at a Deauville gas station and stocked up on ropes, cotton for a gag, and bed sheets. On August 26th, he hid in a cornfield and spent part of the night there, showing great patience. Finally, he heard the distinctive sound of a tent zipper opening. He then saw a child walking with a flashlight toward a nearby tree, likely to use the restroom. Leaving the cornfield, Gerard followed the girl, grabbed her from behind, gagged her with cotton, wrapped her in a sheet, put her in his car, and drove to the edge of a small forest. There, he pulled Delphine out of the car. Gerard tied her up with ropes, committed an assault, then struck her several times on the back of the head with great force. He doused the lifeless body with gasoline, threw the gas canister onto her, and set her on fire, without removing the ropes that bound her. Then he fled the scene. It was a very detailed account. Detectives had no doubt that Gerard was telling the truth, as he knew details the police had not shared with the press. Gerard Leberg had never come under police scrutiny before, although investigators later found it was not because he hadn't committed any crimes. His family had long noticed unusual behaviors that gradually grew into a terrifying obsession. His mother's boyfriend once caught Gerard inappropriately looking at pictures of children. This was the first warning sign, which the family, unfortunately, paid little attention to. In 1984, 4 years before the tragedy at the scout camp, he attempted to harm his 10-year-old niece Sandra when they were alone in the house. One evening, they both went down to the basement where he started inappropriate behavior towards Sandra, but did not complete his actions. Fortunately, he did not succeed. However, he threatened his niece if she told anyone. The family did not report this to the police. Gerard's mother, to her credit, did not cover for her son and insisted he be admitted to the city psychiatric hospital. Gerard dutifully underwent treatment, but as soon as he left the clinic, he harmed his 7-year-old cousin. It seemed that he should have ended up in prison back then, and little Delphine might have been spared. But Gerard slipped through the cracks of the law. Both Gerard himself and his niece and cousin were part of an extremely dysfunctional family, where even without Gerard's actions, conditions were far from normal. Besides Gerard, there were 9 children in the family. Though raised is too strong a word, the parents neglected the well-being and education of the children and committed serious offenses. The father abused one of his daughters. One sister took her own life because of this, and the mother left the children and ran away with a new partner. Such a home environment was certainly not conducive to fostering love or warmth. At 29 years old, Gerard had never had relationships with adult women, even for money. His only interests were magazines and catalogs from which he cut out photographs of children. Colleagues recalled that he liked reading detective novels, but only those that involved crimes against minors. At the restaurant in Deauville where he worked seasonally, nobody really noticed Gerard. They described him as a pleasant guy with a dark look. He was silent. No one knew that in his free time he drew disturbing pictures in notebooks. On January 23, 1991, the police and prosecution conducted a reconstruction of the crime. Gerard agreed to participate. To ensure maximum accuracy, everyone gathered near the tree where Delphine was killed, deep in the night. The weather was very cold, but Gerard obediently and thoroughly demonstrated how the crime took place. He reenacted the assault scene and then set fire to a mannequin representing the victim. It was so realistic and horrifying that one of the gendarmes, who had served for many years, could not hold back his tears. The trial began in May 1992. Gerard was tried both for the murder of Delphine and for what he had done to his niece and cousin. Despite his confession and participation in the crime reconstruction, Gerard pleaded not guilty. Throughout the trial, he kept his head down and never looked up. Even when Delphine's father, Alain Boulet, spoke, the man stood up and with incredible dignity and without shedding a single tear, spoke about his little daughter. He began with the words, "I dreamed of inviting Delphine to dance with me on her 18th birthday." His speech made a huge impression on the jury, as did the evidence against Gerard, including his letter, confession, and the crime reconstruction. There was no doubt about his guilt. The prosecutor demanded a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years, and added that 15 years earlier, he would have demanded the death penalty. His request was granted. This punishment is considered the maximum penalty in France. Gerard did not react to the verdict. He was sent to prison, where he died at the age of 44. In Issy-les-Moulineaux, where the Boulet family lives, a garden was created in honor of little Delphine. It was opened 15 years ago on September 26, 2010. At the entrance, a photo of the little girl was installed, a photo where she smiles just as she always did, before the man who took away her right to grow up and live the life she wanted crossed her path. Delphine's parents joined other families of missing and murdered children to create the Association of Parents of Victim Children. This organization still exists today and supports more than 250 families across the country. Most importantly, it initiated the creation of a genetic database that helps track sex offenders in France.